All right, our last lesson of the year, it's reconstruction. This is right after the Civil War. Now, this time period is going to be extremely hard to explain, and it's going to be a really hard time in our history. You got to think these two regions were just totally fighting each other, the bloodiest war in American history, pretty much. And now we're having to join together, and people are having to be in Congress deciding on laws that were just out fighting each other in the battlefield. So it's going to be pretty hard to cope with. So during the Reconstruction era, there are 3 amendments that are passed. This is extremely important, so I want to get these out of the way before I talk about all the other issues that were going on. The 13th Amendment officially freed slaves. The Emancipation Proclamation was great. It's great that Abraham Lincoln did that, but unfortunately, just because the president says something does not make it a law. The 13th Amendment made it a law because Congress passed it. The legislation passed it. The legislative branch passed it instead of the executive branch, which would be the president. So that made it official. The 14th Amendment gave former slaves citizenship, and the 15th Amendment gave all men over 18 the right to vote. So what would happen is the South, with each one of these amendments, would try to find another way to oppress slaves, to keep them in their original state of being, which would be slaves. So after the 13th Amendment, they passed a bunch of laws that made them being a citizen illegal. It made them pretty much the same as slaves. They had these things called black codes, which we'll talk about later. So then the federal government responded by saying the 14th Amendment, it gave slaves this citizenship. Well, then they said, okay, just because you're a citizen doesn't mean you have the right to vote. I mean, children are citizens, but they don't have the right to vote. So they passed the 15th Amendment, which gave everyone the right to vote. Now, during the Reconstruction period, the Union wanted to unite the country instead of punishing the South. So what they had to do in order to keep the South controlled is they split it up into military districts. They prevent uprisings. Then none of the Confederate generals, none of the Confederate commanders, anyone that was high up in the military, in the Confederate military, none of them were allowed to hold government office, which meant Republicans who were not Confederates, that was what the party of Lincoln was, controlled office for several years. Now, remember, I said this before, Republicans are not modern-day Republicans. The party switched around the 60s. Republicans back then believed in a stronger national government. Republicans today believe in a strong state government. They switched. All right, reversing Reconstructions. This is the South's attempt to find loopholes in those 3 amendments that the federal government passed. After the 13th Amendment was passed, they passed black codes and Jim Crow laws in an attempt to keep slaves from gaining, or former slaves now, from gaining rights. I want you to add this to your notes somewhere at the bottom. The South also implemented sharecropping, which was a way to, quote, pay former slaves to complete the same work they were doing before they were freed. Basically, what this did is the South plantation owners would charge rent at the same price that they would pay out for whatever crop was harvested by the slaves. So then the 14th Amendment was passed, which made everyone born in the United States a citizen. So the South passed literacy tests, which were tests given to people before they were allowed to vote. They usually only gave these tests to minorities, to people of color. Most of the time, if you were white, you could walk into a poll, you could walk into a voting booth and not have to take this test, but they did give it to people of color. You can still look up these literacy tests today. You can find them on the internet, and some of them are incredibly difficult. Like, I struggle passing some of these literacy tests. They are totally designed to make it impossible if you are given a literacy test to pass it. And especially if you're a former slave who was not ever taught to read, so they weren't allowed to vote. They also had poll taxes that were a fee put in place to be able to vote. Now, remember back to sharecropping that I just talked about. If you are barely making rent, you're not going to be able to pay a poll poll tax in order to be able to vote. So these former slaves did not have the money to pay for this. Radical Republicans. After Lincoln was assassinated, President Johnson became president. And he did not share Lincoln's belief that the South shouldn't be punished. He believed they should be punished somewhat. But he also was a South sympathizer. So it's kind of hard to explain what he really believed. But all you need to know is that the Republicans in Congress after Lincoln died believed that that the South should be punished. And with Lincoln gone, they believed, yeah, you know what, we should really punish them now because Lincoln was assassinated. And they also wanted them to be punished for all the sharecropping, all the poll taxes, the literacy tests. All that can't just be that just can't go unnoticed. So the politics of this era were extremely strained from both the war. President Johnson ended up being impeached because he didn't pass civil rights acts. And it was just a very hard time for our country. And congratulations, you made it through all of our lessons. Woohoo! No more ed puzzles.